first place.
This call is now being recorded.
There we go.
I thought it was the new operating system broke my Google Voice account. So I'll tell you about the process very quickly. I'll be quoting your article so we can link to it, putting your university bios on first reference for you and your co-authors. And, you know, I'll be quoting you for what we're talking about today. But, you know, your words are your own. We're on the same team. If you want, I'm going to send this for you to review. If you want to change the quotes, no problem at all, the words or something, just please lean toward simplicity rather than complexity.
Understood. Yeah, I've talked to reporters, for example, and I know their frustration with academics always going for narrow complexity.
Right. When I quote the article, you know, you can't change the wording, but if you think like there's something similar said better elsewhere in the paper, you know, you can substitute that or paraphrase too. But when I quote the article, you know, we want the words to match. So that's the only thing to be aware of.
Okay.
Also, share it with your co-authors any way you see fit. I just want one version back though, so I'm not left to potentially have to clarify contradictory comments.
I can mediate all that, and I think that's a very generous policy. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start. Toward the end, you say, we argue that silence may be the best first step to read and assess the situation accurately and appropriately. You know, pointing out that, you know, actually the silence may be part of the whistleblower's toolbox, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm a whistleblower, say, what are some of the things that should be flags for me that I just shouldn't run and report it, that I should think, you know, silence might be the best step here?
So people are often too quick on the trigger, and I would say, and you know, unless you know your office place is literally on fire, you know, I think it makes sense to slow down a little bit and start gathering the facts. So one of the triggers I like, and we don't really talk about this in the article, but if you've read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and that whole area, in the whole area of research, well, one of the interesting points he gets to is when should we rely on our gut intuition, which is thinking fast, versus when should we be much more methodical and take our time, which is what he would call thinking slow. And he's got this rule of thumb, which I teach to my students now, which is you can rely on your intuition, your fast thinking, when the situation is familiar. You've been here before. That means you have experience with exactly this type of situation and this type of decision, and you've received feedback over time. You made this type of decision, you know, at least a few times before, and you got feedback on whether you made it correctly or not. In those situations, intuition tends to trump a slower, more methodical approach. In all other situations, the slower, more methodical approach tends to trump intuition because, as we know, and Kahneman especially knows, he pioneered a lot of research in this area, that intuition is fraught with all sorts of nasty biases. Okay. So go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Please, go ahead.
No, I'm done. Go, that's your question.
Elsewhere, you said, in very urgent and highly critical circumstances, when it is essential to react immediately and strongly, silence might be too slow. So, you know, when you were saying, you know, literally fire, you know, is the urgent situation someone might get hurt in some way, and everything else is it's time to take a step back and be methodical, like you said?
That's basically what I'm saying. People might get hurt anyway speaking up or being silent. There's no guarantee that it's going to prevent any harm, but one of the things that what we're trying to advocate in this article is preventing a rush to judgment.
Right. I see. And so you said someone could get hurt anyway. So you at one point said silence can be good when an impulsive act to criticize a manager may result in an unfair accusation that harms both the manager's reputation and the relationship between the follower and the manager.
Absolutely. There's a quotation I really like for those kind of situations, and it comes from Ambrose Bierce. And
okay.
he said, speak when you're angry and you'll make the best speech you'll ever regret. Right? And so, one of the situations that if you're too fast rather than slower and being silent for a while trying to understand what's actually going on is, you could be like really upset. You think somebody has acted, unethically, and it makes you really angry. You experience this moral outrage, and then you immediately voice that. And that's a problem for a couple reasons. Because one, you may not really know what's going on yet. And two, I think more to the spirit of Bierce's quote, is that once we speak in an angry fashion, we often lose control of the conversation. Okay.
Yeah, that's almost so, like the rules about answering emails or in a lot of contexts, it seems like your paper's about major problems like whistleblowing, but the basic rules about, if you're very emotional even in a meeting, it's better not to maybe even open your mouth.
Right.
That kind of thing.
That's right.
Okay. Tell me about the See, Judge, Act model.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're trying to understand is when employees tend to speak up or when they don't speak up, And so this is a model that's actually kind of been around for a while. And so we're just trying to divide up the process into 3 stages. So first, so I'm observing something, and say we're asking whether I'm going to voice it or stay silent. The first thing is I have to see the act. I have to see the harm, and so there's got to be a certain amount of visibility to it. And so we go through and we talk about various reasons why we may or may not see it. We might see part of it, but not recognize it for what it is if we're only seeing part of it. So. I think we got a couple paragraphs there, but so is it public? Is it tightly coupled to the behavior? So I think we have this. Yeah, that's right. I'm just trying to remember I put that in the right spot. Yeah, so the consequences of the behavior tightly coupled to the act, right? Sometimes the effects of somebody's actions, the harmful effects, happen much later, and you can't always sort of trace back exactly what caused it. Whereas if the effect tends to follow the action right away, you're much more likely to see it. So we're trying to, look at some of the reasons that we've seen in the literature about people may or may not see that the act actually happened. But let's suppose they see it, right? That's not enough for them to break the silence and act and voice something. What really matters crucially is their judgment of that act. So do they judge it relatively benignly, or do they judge it harshly? Obviously, the more harshly they judge that act, and the more likely they're going to the original action, then the more likely they are to act themselves, and such as voice.
Yeah, silence. Now, and you mentioned judging. You said judge it harshly, but judging. You also said judging the behavior is counter-normative and intentional.
Yep.
What about an unintentional? I'm a manager. I make a counter-normative, unintentional act, but I do nothing to fix it. Isn't that just as bad?
No, research suggests it's not quite as bad. Well, presuming that, I as the observer observe it correctly, but let's assume for a minute that I'm observing it correctly. There is something called negligence. And so some accidents aren't negligence. Some accidents are negligence. You had a responsibility. You didn't live up to that responsibility. But even, accidental acts that are negligent, they're judged somewhat harshly, but not as harshly as judging an act that was intentional. So if you and I work together, and let's say you're my boss, and you make a decision that makes my work life much more difficult and destroys a career opportunity for me, let's say, so that's the harm. Did you do it by accident? Were you engaging in action you simply weren't thinking about me? I don't like that, but I'm not going to judge that terribly harshly. Did you not think about me, but you were supposed to think about me? So maybe it's a little bit more negligence. Okay, I'm going to judge you a little bit more harshly. But if you did it on purpose, knowing that it would harm me, well, that's a whole nother cat.
Right. That's more than maybe just losing trust. You've created almost an enemy potentially.
That's right. And there's an analog in criminal prosecution and sentencing, right? So when we think about, if my act results in the death of somebody else, well, is that manslaughter, which is more like negligence, and then there's different degrees of murder depending on how premeditated it was, and that is how intentional it was. So a crime of passion is bad. I'm going to go to prison for that, but it's not as bad if I've been plotting it for weeks.
I see. Okay.
Right.
I understand. I want to go through a few of the examples you gave, and because I'm trying to tally the different ways that silence can be used. So if you can, tell me if I'm missing one. So you mentioned, taking incremental steps to gather evidence.
Yeah.
And ultimately take acting. Using silence and voice iteratively. Gathering facts, asking for more facts, etc. And then you said, the other one you mentioned strategic silence is a political skill, basically like to confuse the problem maker that you may be on his or her side.
Yeah. So this idea of that silence is the punishment itself. So that's what we mean by strategic silence. The other forms of silence are really more about, I need to understand better what's going on. But silence can also be the punishment itself. So I can withhold support. One of the things that we discovered, particularly Bob Bees and I, when we did a lot of research on workplace revenge, is that a very sort of common form of revenge, and people would talk about it as workplace revenge, is what's called the freeze out. So it's like, okay, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And if I don't have to talk to you anymore, we might have been buddies at work, but you know what? You went too far, you harmed me, and I don't want to talk to you unless I absolutely have to.
I see. Okay, that I was going to ask you about. You mentioned a tool for revenge. The example you gave. Employees are attending a meeting with their leader and his or her manager. When the leader's manager asks questions, the leader doesn't have the answers, but the employees do, and they remain silent, making their manager seem incompetent. I was wondering if that's really revenge, which is a strong word in this context, for workplace, or is that more just a harsh way to seek justice? Now,
so
sorry, go ahead.
Historically, revenge and justice were the same thing, and they've really kind of become separated over time as the state has taken over punishment, because revenge is a very sloppy form of justice. So that's a good thing that the state has basically taken that over. But in terms of workplace revenge, acts can have multiple motives. And we're saying when we label something as workplace revenge, if it includes the motive, whatever other motives it may have as well, but if it includes the motive of I want to see the harm doer suffer.
Okay.
And yeah.
Okay, and I wasn't getting into the academic terms, but what you just described certainly sounds like what the average person would consider revenge.
Yeah, you harmed me. You made me suffer. Now I'm going to make you suffer.
Right. Another one you mentioned, creating opportunities, or I guess time to create a coalition of like-minded people.
Mm-hmm. So often, kind of biding your time, you might be able to, particularly if you're feeling relatively powerless, you could get other people banded together who are also having the same problem with the same person, and then you could have a coalition that gives you perhaps a little bit more power or a little bit more legitimacy. So, people often say, look, I don't just think that was wrong. So do all these other people. Or I'm not just asking for this. We're all asking for this. as opposed to if I just sort of quickly go after it myself and I don't build a coalition first, it's easier for whoever I'm talking to, whether it's a harm doer or somebody who can do something about the harm doer. It's just, I'm just representing myself. I'm just a lone crank.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to ask you about communication. I thought that was interesting. Is that more an example of silence, or is it more an example of, voice in a certain setting?
I think you can argue it either way.
Okay.
I mean, part of it is, so there's, and particularly that was in Japan, and so there's this culture of, which is also a high power distance culture. I mean, where rank and authority they take that pretty seriously, and so there's certain things that in polite conversation, by their definition of politeness, you just don't say during business hours, and you don't cause people loss of face. You particularly don't cause authorities loss of face, and so in that situation, they have to withhold a lot of disagreements that they might have about something. But part of the way they get around that, because otherwise you could think it's like, well, then how does anyone ever tell the truth? And if they never tell the truth, how do they prevent bad ideas from happening? So part of it is that in other environments, particularly when there's alcohol involved and after hours, it is considered more acceptable to say what's really on your mind. And I'm not an expert on Japanese culture, so I'm not entirely sure of all the reasons for this. I think I've heard, you probably should verify this if you put it in the article, that in part it's because they can just blame it on the alcohol. Well, it's just alcohol talking. I was drunk, give me a break.
There's examples in the James Clavell book Shogun where that's the explanation. You can always just blame it on the sake.
Yeah.
I have two more questions.
Sure.
You mentioned the Me Too movement. Our quote, silence is sometimes good viewpoint may be particularly problematic. And then later you say, perhaps our See Judge Model Act can help us understand why leaders got away with harassment for so long and some of the ways organizations were complicit in allowing leaders to continue the destructive behaviors. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah. So why did it take so long for people to really start speaking up about the sexual harassment that's been going on in the workplace, particularly in the film industry? And so trying to understand why that is, we think that the See Judge model will help us sort of speculate, generate, as we scientists like to say, hypotheses that need to be tested, but gives us some room to sort of speculate on, in fact, what may have been going on there. So, one of the things is how many people really saw that it was happening. Sexual harassment, particularly at the so-called casting couch, this is kind of stuff that occurs behind closed doors. So certainly the victim knows when they've been harassed in that situation, but who all did they talk to? Men in particular, I think, are somewhat surprised by some of this, the men who don't participate in that. So there's an issue of whether they saw it. Then there's kind of the issue of, when talking about judging it, is it counter-normative? Well, by the rest of society standards. Yeah, but the rest of society standards, absolutely. But, the fact that in Hollywood it's called the casting couch, that they've got this name for it, suggests that it's a fairly common thing. And therefore, at least within that industry, may not be as highly counter-normative as it was elsewhere. And it also reminds me of a saying, I'm trying to remember who originally said this, but the saying basically goes, what becomes expected becomes just. That bad behaviors, if done frequently enough, they become the new normal, and people may lose their moral outrage about it. So what's kind of interesting about the Me Too movement is, I'm guessing, I've never worked in the film industry, but I'm guessing that, that the casting couch it was normal for so long that a lot of people just didn't have the sense of outrage about it. But then I think with perhaps broader...
There's even jokes about it rather than outrage.
Right. But now with the broader shifts in society over the last few years, it's outrageous again.
Yeah, I see. My last question, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
You're giving an elevator speech to a manager or business leader about the key takeaway or takeaways from your article, what would you say?
I would say sometimes silence is good, primarily because people often act too quickly before getting the facts. That would be the main thing. And if we're going up another 20 floors, you know, I would probably talk about that it's important to allow due process to work. So, you know, if we're talking about serious accusations, I think that there's got to be due process. And one of the things that worries me about the Me Too movement, there's a lot I love about it, but the one thing that worries me about it is the lack of due process for so many people. There's an accusation. The accusation is instantly believed. The person's career is over before often they got to tell their side of the story, before if they're being accused of truly illegal behavior before it went through the court. You know, another interesting one is Senator Al Franken. You know, that didn't even go through the Senate Ethics Committee. They demanded his resignation before going through the Senate Ethics Committee. There was no due process. So, not that I don't know that he wasn't guilty. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, you know, we really needed the due process to be sure of his level of guilt.
Right.
And, yeah, that worries me.
Okay, well, that's great, Tom. Did you have any questions for me?
No, I think you've answered them. And usually when I talk to some, the question is, you know, when might I see a draft and be able to comment on it? But I think you told me how that works. Oh, I don't think you said when, but
about a week or two.
About a week or two? Fantastic.
Yep. And you know, there's no rush getting it back to me. When just so you know, the insight, it'll be promoted. When it's live, I'll send you a link. You know, after I'm done with it, it gets copy edited, then we post it on the site. Then we put it in the next Insights newsletter. We'll promote it there on the first business day of the month. So depending when you get it back to me, it'll be in the next newsletter. Okay. And then I'll let you know when we promote it on social media, on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook.
Yeah, that would be great. That's very nice of you.
And you can, and the you know, the link itself to the summary, you know, share far and wide. Your university Marcom department might be interested. Your co-authors, universities might be interested too. But you know, you can share with anyone you want.
Yeah, I'll definitely send it around and definitely let our Marcom know. They like to know these kinds of things. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for your
thanks, Mike.
time and your thoughtful responses, Tom. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for your time and for selecting our article.
All right. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cool.
All right. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.